Hey, what's going on, guys? The Horror Man back with another random wrestling review. This time I'm covering the Brawl for All. I do have the entire Brawl for All tournament recorded on tape, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to show the Best of Raw 15th Anniversary DVD set, since all of the Brawl for All matches took place on Raw. The Brawl for All is considered by many, inside and outside the wrestling business, to be the worst idea in wrestling history. I'm gonna be honest right up front though, I've always been a huge fan of it. I loved it back when it first aired, and I still love it to this day. As a matter of fact, I've revisited the tournaments multiple times over the years since. There was just something so interesting to me about seeing how tough the wrestlers actually were. Finding out who the toughest guy in the locker room was is cool to me. In this video, I'll be briefly covering each of the fights in the Brawl for All tournaments, and sharing some information along the way. The Brawl for All was an idea pitched to Vince McMahon by Vince Russo. For those of you unfamiliar with that name, Vince Russo was once a head writer for WWF. And with all of the criticism he receives, I think it's important to keep in mind that Vince Russo was a huge part of the Attitude Era. Many wrestling fans consider that to be the best era in history. Russo got the idea for the Brawl for All when he heard Bradshaw, better known now as JBL, talking backstage. Allegedly, Bradshaw had claimed if wrestling were real, he could take anyone in the locker room in a fight. Basically, JBL believed he was the toughest guy in the World Wrestling Federation. During this time, tough man competitions were popular. So Vince Russo thought he might capitalize on that. More specifically, he thought WWF should capitalize on that. But even more importantly, he thought it would be an opportunity to see Bradshaw get his ass kicked. Vince Russo claimed he believed there were at least 10 guys in the locker room that could beat up JBL. His personal favorite to win the whole tournament was the Godfather. But I'll get to more about each of the contestants in just a bit. Although he was reluctant at first, Vince McMahon ultimately agreed to the idea, and the Brawl for All was developed. Now let me make this very clear for those of you who don't know. The Brawl for All would literally be a shoot tournament. The wrestlers involved would actually fight each other. It was not faked, it was not kayfabe, there were no storylines. Everyone would find out once and for all who the toughest guy in the locker room really was. Would it be the braggadocious Bradshaw, as Vince Russo described him? Soon enough, we'd learn the truth. The Brawl for All tournament was held from June 29th, 1998 through August 24th, 1998. Each of the fights, as I already mentioned, were held on Raw. The rules of each fight were as follows. Matches would consist of 3 one-minute rounds. The fighter who landed the most punches each round would earn 5 points. Each takedown would earn them another 5 points. Knockdowns were worth 10 points. And a knockout would obviously end the fight. The wrestlers would be wearing boxing gloves. They were not allowed to kick. They could not attempt submission holds. Basically, all they could do was throw punches and attempt takedowns. The Brawl for All tournament began with 16 contestants. Apparently, WWF management met with all of the wrestlers on the roster, offering them the opportunity to join. There would be cash bonuses for each fight, with obviously the winners earning more. And the winner of the entire tournament would supposedly receive $100,000. Not to mention, word was they'd be receiving a huge push with a feud against Stone Cold Steve Austin, who was world champion at the time. Top guys like Stone Cold, The Undertaker, The Rock, and Triple H felt they did not belong in this tournament. They did not want to diminish their status in the Federation in any way, so they elected not to join. Those who did choose to participate were more low to mid-card level guys. They saw the Brawl for All as not only an opportunity to earn some extra money, but to get the push they desired. Now I'll briefly go through each of the 16 contestants and say a few words about them. Of course, you have Bradshaw, around who the entire tournament was created. Vince Russo was really hoping to see him get knocked out. He hoped JBL would embarrass himself after bragging so much in the locker room. Russo saw Bradshaw as a bully, and he wanted someone to shut him up. Then there was the Godfather, who was also known in the Federation as Kama Mustafa and Papa Shango. He was Vince Russo's pick to win, not only because he was huge in stature, but because he basically beat up pimps for a living. Yes, that's right, he beat up pimps. He also had a background in boxing and was a super strong guy. Too Cold Scorpio, or simply Scorpio, entered the tournament. He was trying to leave behind his Flash Funk gimmick in the WWF. Despite not being the biggest guy, he was known to be tough after getting into some real brawls on the road. 8-Ball entered. He was a big guy who was also known to be very tough. There was Bart Gunn, who was mostly famous for being the tag team partner of Billy Gunn when they were the Smoking Guns. He was currently part of the new Midnight Express, along with Bob Holly. Speaking of Bob, he entered the tournament as well. Holly would go on to become best known as Hardcore Holly. Mark Merrow, who was a 5-time Golden Gloves champion in New York State, was in there. Steve Blackman, known as one of the most dangerous men in WWF, had joined. He had legitimate martial arts experience and multiple black belts. Speaking of which, there was Dan Severn, who was a UFC legend. He's still to this day, in some people's eyes, one of the greatest UFC champions of all time. Brackis, who was known for his extraordinary physique as a bodybuilder, entered the tournament. Darren Drozdorf, or simply Droz, who went from being an NFL football player to wrestler and all-around tough guy, joined. Road Warrior Hawk, who was known for getting into some real fights over the years and being a legitimate tough guy, was in the tournament. Savio Vega was participating, and a big reason why there was a rule against kicking. Apparently, it was said that if kicking were allowed, Savio may have ended up killing everyone. Mark Canterbury, who was better known as Henry Godwin in the Federation, decided to take his shot in the tournament. He was just a big guy with raw toughness. Quebecer Pierre entered the Brawl for All, despite having literally no vision in one eye. Part of his gimmick was wearing an eye patch, but it was legitimate. And the final contestant in the Brawl for All tournament was significant. Dr. Death, Steve Williams. Dr. Death had recently been brought into the WWF by talent relations manager Jim Ross. The two of them had a very close relationship, and Dr. Death, Steve Williams, was known all over the world as one of the toughest guys on the planet. With the exception of Vince Russo, who believed in The Godfather, Dr. Death was the odds-on favorite to win the whole thing. Vince McMahon, JR, and the rest of the WWF management saw this as an opportunity to push Dr. Death into a feud with Stone Cold Steve Austin. The plan was to use the Brawl for All to catapult Dr. Death into World Championship contention, even though these fights would not be fixed like a typical wrestling match. They had all the confidence in the world in Dr. Death. The thing is, they weren't even quiet about it either. Everyone in the tournament and locker room know that Dr. Death was their #1 guy. Management treated everyone else as if they didn't stand a chance. Listen, I get it. It made sense. Dr. Death was no joke. Even with contestants such as the Godfather, Dan Severn, and Steve Blackman in the tournaments, Dr. Death was still favored to win. Of course, we can't forget about Bradshaw either, the self-proclaimed toughest guy in the locker room, and the reason why the Brawl for All was created in the first place. The first two fights in the Brawl for All tournaments took place on that June 29th episode of Raw. Jim Ross and Jerry the King Lawler are on commentary. The contestants for each fight come out to the same theme music. It's the Brawl for All theme, and it was great. It was theme music that got you pumped. At least, it did for me. The very first Brawl for All match would feature Marc Mero under the moniker Marvelous Marc Mero facing off against Steve Blackman. It has been said that all of the contestants' names were placed in a paper bag and drawn at random to create the tournament bracket. Although at least one of the contestants in the Brawl for All believed this part was manipulated. As soon as the bell rings for the Mero-Blackman fights, Mero chants begin in the crowd. The funny thing is, the audience doesn't know what to expect with this new Brawl for All tournament. They're used to seeing kayfabe wrestling. Blackman gets 2 takedowns immediately, then a third, and the crowd boos. Blackman gets a 4th takedown, and then round 1 ends. Blackman apparently also landed a few more punches in this round, considering he's ahead 25-0 going into the second. Round 2 begins with the two exchanging punches. Soon enough, though, Blackman gets his 5th and 6th takedown on Mero. Steve lands a huge punch, and Mark lands some as well. Blackman gets his 7th takedown as the round ends. At this point, the crowd is cheering, "We want wrestling." They're getting bored with Steve Blackman dominating Marc Mero by simply taking him down over and over and over. He's controlling the fight. Poor Mark's boxing background is not saving him here. Blackman gets 3 more takedowns in round 3, bringing his total to 10, before being announced the winner by points as the crowd boos. The second Brawl for All fight features Mark Canterbury against Bradshaw. It's time for JBL to put up or shut up. The fight begins with them both throwing wild punches. It's like watching a whiskey-induced bar fight. Canterbury attempts a takedown on Bradshaw, but Bradshaw defends, and round 1 ends. Both men already seemed gassed, and Bradshaw has a 5-0 lead, having landed the most punches in round 1. Round 2 features more wild punching from both, and Bradshaw rocks Mark at one point. Mark attempts another takedown, but Bradshaw blocks again, as round 2 ends, and Bradshaw returns to his corner with a busted lip. Even still, Bradshaw still seems to be ahead in points. In round 3, Canterbury finally succeeds in taking down Bradshaw, but when he goes for another, Bradshaw defends. The fight ends with Bradshaw winning by points, and his claim about being the toughest guy in the locker room is still alive. The following Monday featured 2 more Brawl for All fights. The first being Brackis versus Savio Vega. In round 1, Savio attempts a takedown, but Brackis defends. And then Brackis takes down Vega. Those will be the only 5 points Brackis earns in this fight though, because Savio begins pounding him. Brackis is stumbling, his knees are buckling, and Savio almost punches him out of the ring. Luckily, Brackis is saved by the bell. Round 2 is more punishment from Savio. Brackis attempts a takedown, but Vega blocks it. Brackis is getting destroyed by Savio's fists as round 2 ends. He stumbles back to his corner, almost out on his feet, and you can clearly see he has a broken nose. Savio takes him down in the 3rd round, and then knocks him down. Brackis is able to get up from the standing 8 count, but ultimately he loses by points. This was a very one-sided fight in favor of Savio Vega. Next up, we have Road Warrior Hawk versus Draws. We get strong punches and strong chins from both guys. Hawk loses his mouthpiece, and the referee puts it back in his mouth. Draws attempts a takedown, and as he has Hawk off of his feet and in the air, the bell rings, meaning Draws won't get those 5 points. The unofficial scorecards have Hawk up 5-0. Hawk attempts a takedown as round 2 begins, but Draws blocks it and lands 2 big rights. Hawk fires back with some good shots, but then Draws rocks Hawk, sending him backwards. Draws rocks him again, and now Hawk has a broken nose. At the end of round 2, the score is 5-5. Hawk comes out in the final round swinging wildly. He loses his mouthpiece again, so Draws spits out his too. The crowd goes wild, and it's such a cool moment. It's just 2 tough guys going at it and having fun, putting on a show for their fans. In my opinion, it's such an underrated moment in the tournament from Draws. The 2 go back and forth throwing punches, and the fight ends. They hug, and it's ruled a draw. With Hawk having a broken nose, though, he won't be able to continue, so Draws moves on to the quarterfinals. The next fight pits both Midnight Express members against each other. Bart Gunn versus Bob Holly. Shawn Michaels joins JR and the King on commentary for this one. Nice jab from Bart Gunn, and then he lands a barrage of punches. So far, these 2 look more poised than anybody else in the tournament up until now. Round 1 ends with Bart Gunn up by 5. Coming into round 2, Bob Holly's right eye is swollen. He begins working on Bart's body, but Bart Gunn seems to simply be giving it up, knowing he's not really receiving much damage. Bart absorbs the body shots unfazed and just starts landing haymakers on Bob Holly. Bart lands a left that sends Bob from one side of the ring to the other, and Holly later addressed this in interviews. He says he doesn't even know what happened. At one point, he was standing in one spot, and at the next, he was on the other side of the ring. Bart is dominating with punches now and has a 10-0 lead at the end of round 2. Bob Holly is rocked in round 3. He staggers, but stays on his feet. You can actually hear Bart Gunn's punches land louder than any other in this Brawl for All so far. Let me tell you, Bob Holly is a tough son of a bitch not being knocked out. Bart wins by points, but I'll come back to this. Next up, we have Pierre versus frontrunner Dr. Death Steve Williams. Poor Pierre. JR is really pushing Dr. Death on commentary. They even show a clip of Steve Williams' old football coach talking about how tough he is. They haven't done this for anyone else in the tournament. Dr. Death gets an immediate takedown on Pierre, and then the 2 throw wild punches at each other. Pierre gets rocked, and Dr. Death gets another takedown. JR continues pushing the Doctor, as Pierre gets a takedown, and round 1 ends. Dr. Death is ahead, 15-5, going into round 2. JR is still pushing Steve, as he gets a takedown. He throws some hard punches, and Pierre reciprocates with some strong punches of his own. Suddenly, Dr. Death rocks Pierre and knocks him down. The ref begins the standing 8 count, but the bell rings. Dr. Death has extended his lead, 35-5. The Dr. Death chants begin in the crowd. The WWF must have been loving it. This is exactly what they wanted and knew would happen. In round 3, Dr. Death unleashes a barrage of punches at Pierre. Pierre tries his hardest to fight back, but Steve is all over him. Pierre goes down, and there's another standing 8 count. The ref calls it, though. This one is over. Dr. Death wins by TKO. The first TKO in the tournament. Allegedly, after the results of this fight, Dr. Death was paid the $100,000 prize already. Talk about counting your chickens, huh? The Godfather versus Dan Severn is next, with Shawn Michaels back on commentary with JR and Jerry Lawler. Severn attempts a takedown, but the Godfather blocks it. The Godfather is doing a great job defending the takedowns. Severn, using his natural instincts from his UFC days, keeps holding the Godfather, so the ref yells at him to break the hold. Round 1 ends with Severn up 5-0 for a possible takedown that no one saw. The Godfather lands a hard right in round 2, and Severn holds him against the ropes. Severn takes down the Godfather and then won't let him go. The ref is screaming at Dan to break the hold. The referee can even be heard yelling, "Penalize him." The Godfather blocks another takedown as round 2 ends. The crowd is booing now and chanting once again, "We want wrestling. We want wrestling." After 2 rounds, the Godfather is ahead, 10-5. Severn gets a questionable takedown and then refuses to let go of the Godfather in round 3. He's announced the winner, but that's questionable too. The crowd boos at the results. To me, it looked like the Godfather won that fight, but Severn got the win. There goes Vince Russo's pick. Or does he? Soon after, Dan Severn withdraws himself from the tournament, so the Godfather will move on to the quarterfinals after all. It's almost as if he should have won in the first place. The final first-round matchup sees Scorpio against 8-Ball. Round 1 is a slugfest, with 8-Ball landing some heavy shots. Scorpio seems to even the score in round 2 with some takedowns. In round 3, 8-Ball, the bigger man, is just simply out of gas, and Scorpio outpunches him, earning the victory by points.